At 6:40 in the evening, Eastern Time, a B-2 Spirit bomber flying in near total radio silence released two 30,000-pound bombs over a mountain in central Iran. It was 2:10 in the morning local time. The target underneath that mountain had been considered untouchable for almost 2 decades. By the time the last of 14 of these bombs had fallen, the United States had done something no country had ever done before in combat: dropped the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a bomb built for exactly one kind of target on exactly the kind of target it was built for. This is the story of what actually happened that night above Fordow, and just as importantly, what happened in the weeks and months after, when the people who were supposed to know what those bombs actually did under the mountain started disagreeing with each other, loudly, in public, in a way that a battle so carefully planned was never supposed to allow. Fordow sits about 60 miles southwest of Tehran, near the holy city of Qom, and it was never meant to be found. Western intelligence agencies only learned of its existence in 2009, when the United States, Britain, and France went public with evidence that Iran was building a second enrichment facility, hidden inside a mountain, years before it was operational. That single fact told analysts almost everything they needed to know about its purpose. A civilian nuclear power program doesn't need to be buried under 260 to 300 feet of rock. A program designed to survive an airstrike does. For the next 16 years, Fordow became the single hardest problem in non-proliferation planning. According to reporting from Scientific American and multiple Congressional Research Service briefings, engineers at the Pentagon spent years designing a weapon specifically because Fordow existed. A bomb heavy enough and precise enough to punch through hardened rock and concrete rated at roughly 5,000 pounds per square inch of compressive strength, then detonate below the surface rather than on top of it. That weapon became the GBU-57. It is roughly 20 feet long, weighs about 30,000 pounds, and according to the U.S. Air Force can only be carried, and only ever has been carried, by the B-2 Spirit. Nothing else in the American arsenal can lift it, let alone deliver it with precision. The engineering problem itself sounds almost absurd when you say it out loud. How do you punch a hole through a mountain of concrete and granite, reach a target hundreds of feet down, and destroy it without ever crossing into nuclear yield yourself? According to Scientific American's reporting on the weapon's development, American planners had studied this exact dilemma since well before Fordow was even discovered, going back to Israel's strikes on Iraq's Osirak reactor in 1981 and on Syria's reactor in 2007, both of which taught regional nuclear programs a hard lesson. Build your most sensitive infrastructure where conventional airstrikes can't reach it, and you buy yourself years, maybe decades, of protection. Iran appears to have taken that lesson seriously. The GBU-57 was the American answer to it. A steel-cased weapon carrying roughly 5,300 pounds of explosive, reportedly capable of burrowing through around 200 feet of hardened rock or reinforced concrete before its fuse, individually programmed for each drop, triggers detonation at a calculated depth rather than on impact. If one bomb isn't enough, the design allows for a second to follow it down through the same hole, drilling further before it explodes. A tactic munitions experts describe as inherently riskier, because it requires extraordinary precision on the second drop to hit a hole you can't see from the cockpit. For 15 years, that bomb sat in the American inventory, tested but never used. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane would later tell reporters at the Pentagon that the entire program, from design to employment, was 15 years in the making, with Fordow itself described as the primary driver behind the weapon's development. In other words, this bomb existed because this mountain existed. Sooner or later, one was always going to meet the other. That moment arrived in June of 2025, but the road to it started weeks earlier, and it didn't start with the United States. It started with Israel. On June 13th, Israel launched a surprise military campaign against Iran, striking nuclear facilities, missile production sites, and senior military and scientific figures, opening what would become known as the 12-Day War. Israeli jets hit hard and hit fast, degrading Iran's air defenses within days. But there was one target Israel's own arsenal could not touch. Fordow, buried inside that mountain, was untouched throughout the entire Israeli campaign, according to Al Jazeera's ongoing coverage of the conflict. Israeli officials were blunt about why. They did not have a bomb capable of reaching it. Only the United States did. The human cost of that first week, before the United States ever entered the fight, was already significant. By the time a ceasefire eventually took hold in late June, Iranian officials said at least 610 of their citizens had been killed over the 12 days of fighting, while Israel reported 28 deaths on its own side from Iranian missile retaliation, according to Al Jazeera's timeline of the conflict. Those figures, like most coming out of a fast-moving war with restricted independent access to Iran, are difficult to verify precisely and should be read as reported, not confirmed beyond doubt. For a week, the world watched to see whether Washington would join the fight. President Trump weighed the decision publicly and privately. debating the risk of pulling the United States directly into a Middle East war against the backdrop of ongoing, if strained, diplomatic contacts with Tehran. On the night of June 21st into the 22nd, he gave the order. What followed was Operation Midnight Hammer, and despite the name suggesting a single decisive blow, it was in reality a massive, carefully choreographed deception operation involving dozens of aircraft, multiple false formations, sent west over the Pacific to draw attention away from the real strike package, and 7 B-2 bombers flying more than 18 hours from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, refueling in midair along the way. What made the mission remarkable wasn't just the bomb, it was everything built around hiding it. Before the strike package ever crossed into Iranian airspace, a separate group of B-2s was deliberately flown west, out over the Pacific, as a decoy formation designed to pull public and adversary attention away from the real route. The actual strike force flew east, refueling multiple times over an 18-hour transit from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, maintaining strict radio discipline the entire way. It was, by the Pentagon's own description, one of the largest B-2 operational employments in the aircraft's history. And, by design, almost nobody outside a small circle in Washington knew it was happening until the bombs were already falling. According to the Pentagon's own account, delivered by General Kane and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in a detailed briefing days later, the lead B-2 dropped the first 2 massive ordnance penetrators on Fordow at 6:40 p.m. Eastern Time. More followed. By the time the mission was complete, US B-2s had dropped 12 MOPs on Fordow, and 2 more on an underground portion of the Natanz enrichment complex, according to the Pentagon's own disclosures. Separately, a U.S. Navy submarine in the region launched more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles at surface targets at Isfahan, a third nuclear-linked site that did not require the mountain-piercing bomb because its key infrastructure sat above ground. In total, U.S. forces employed around 75 precision-guided weapons that night, including 14 GBU-57s, the first time in history that weapon had ever been used in combat. Trump announced the strikes himself before dawn, in a post on Truth Social, and later in a televised address to the nation. His language was unambiguous. He said the United States had completed a, quote, very successful attack on the 3 nuclear sites, and declared that Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities had been, in his words, completely and totally obliterated. It was a claim built for a headline, and it became one. But it was also a claim that would take on a life of its own in the days that followed. Because obliterated is not a word intelligence analysts use. It is not a technical term. It is a political one. And almost immediately, the technical people started using different words. The first hint of the gap came from the one organization in the world whose entire job is to inspect nuclear sites and say, plainly, what is and isn't still standing. The International Atomic Energy Agency. Its Director General, Rafael Grossi, is not an alarmist by nature, and in the days after the strike, he was notably careful with his language. Grossi told reporters that the extent of the damage to Fordow's uranium enrichment facility, built, as he put it, deep inside a mountain, was, quote, not immediately possible to assess, given its underground location and the penetrating nature of the bombs used. He said it was clear Fordow had been directly impacted, but he also said explicitly that the degree of damage inside the enrichment halls themselves could not be determined with certainty. That is a very different sentence than obliterated. Commercial satellite imagery gave outside analysts their first real look. Al Jazeera's fact-checking unit, SANAD, working with independent researchers, identified 3 visible points of damage at Fordow: 2 craters, consistent with bunker-busting munitions, and a damaged air defense position guarding the site. Maxar Technologies' imagery from the days following the strike showed dust, cratering, and disturbed earth around the ridgeline above the enrichment halls, visible evidence that something enormous had happened at the surface. What it could not show, by definition, was what had happened 200 feet below it. That's the entire design premise of a bunker buster. If you can see the damage from space, the bomb probably failed. So for the first 72 hours, the story was Trump's story. Obliterated, total success. Israel's own Atomic Energy Commission backed that framing, telling reporters the strikes had rendered Fordow's underground enrichment site, in their assessment, inoperable. Hegseth and Kane held a Pentagon briefing reinforcing the same message, walking through the weapons specifications and the mission's execution in granular detail, treating the operation as a case study in American precision strike capability. Then, on June 24th, CNN published a story that changed the entire conversation. Citing multiple sources familiar with a preliminary battle damage assessment from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Pentagon's own military intelligence arm, CNN reported that the strikes had not, in fact, destroyed the core of Iran's nuclear program. According to the people who had seen the assessment, the impact at all 3 sites was largely restricted to above-ground structures. Badly damaged, but not the whole story. The centrifuges themselves at Fordow and Natanz were described by one source as largely, quote, intact. Another source told CNN that intelligence indicated Iran had moved its stockpile of enriched uranium out of the sites before the American strikes even began. The blunt verdict attributed to the DIA assessment was that the strikes had set Iran's program back at most a few months. The White House response was immediate and furious. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt called the assessment, quote, flat out wrong, and accused the person who leaked it of being a, quote, low-level loser inside the intelligence community. The New York Times, reporting separately on the same document, added further detail. The DIA assessment reportedly found that the strikes had sealed the entrances to 2 of the facilities, including Fordow, without collapsing the underground structures behind them, meaning the real question was no longer whether the mountain had been cracked open, but how long it would take Iran to dig itself back out. Some estimates circulating around the leaked assessment, according to the New York Post's sourcing from Fox News, suggested Iran could resume enrichment in as little as 1 to 2 months on the low end, or up to a year on the high end. None of those numbers matched obliterated. The disagreement quickly spilled beyond the White House press room and into the intelligence community's own internal messaging. Reporting compiled by Just Security's National Security Desk noted that officials' public statements on the fate of Iran's uranium stockpile visibly shifted over the course of that first week. Vice President Vance, in an interview the morning after the strikes, was the first senior official to suggest publicly that Iran might have relocated its stockpile before the bombs fell. Later that same week, Hegseth, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Trump himself all moved to the opposite position, insisting nuclear material had remained at the sites throughout. That kind of shift, within days, among the officials most responsible for briefing the public, is itself part of the story. Not because it proves anything about where the uranium actually was, but because it shows how uncertain even the people making confident public statements were behind closed doors. Just Security's analysis also noted a divergence between the Israeli and American read on the strikes more broadly. Israeli intelligence reportedly leaned toward describing the sites as simply non-operational, on the assumption Iran would abandon Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan altogether and rebuild somewhere new, while American intelligence, according to statements attributed to Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard and House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Michael McCaul, treated the damage as a temporary setback Iran would eventually repair and return to. Trump did not back down. In an all-caps post on Truth Social, he declared the nuclear sites in Iran, quote, completely destroyed. Hegseth, pressed directly by a reporter about what had changed in the administration's public description of the strike, didn't retreat either. He said people could use whatever word they wanted, defeat, destroyed, obliterated, but insisted that anyone looking at the firepower involved would recognize it had to have had a devastating effect. He and Trump both explicitly denied, on the record, that Iran had been able to move its uranium stockpile ahead of the strikes. Hegseth said he was not aware of any intelligence suggesting material had been moved. That denial ran directly into what the IAEA itself would later confirm. In the weeks following the strikes, Director General Grossi disclosed that Iran had roughly 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, a stockpile the agency had verified just days before the fighting began on June 13th, and that its location afterward could not be confirmed with certainty. The IAEA also reported additional impact points identified at Fordow and Natanz beyond the initial assessment, and confirmed that some localized radioactive and chemical release had occurred inside facilities that had contained nuclear material, though it found no evidence of increased radiation levels outside those sites. By late July of 2025, a clearer, if still incomplete, picture had formed. At Natanz, the IAEA's reporting indicated the above-ground pilot fuel enrichment plant had been destroyed outright, and that a loss of power to the site may have caused further damage to centrifuges underground even without a direct hit. At Isfahan, the agency confirmed damage to the chemical laboratory, the uranium conversion plant, a facility that manufactured reactor fuel for Tehran, and a plant used to convert enriched material into metal form, a process step widely regarded as one of the more sensitive, weapons-relevant stages of the fuel cycle. Fordow remained the biggest question mark of the three. The entrances were sealed, the underground halls were, by most independent assessments, seriously affected, but whether the actual centrifuge cascades deep inside the mountain had been destroyed, damaged, or simply buried under rubble and waiting to be dug out again, nobody outside a very small circle of intelligence officials could say with confidence. And even inside that circle, as the CNN and New York Times reporting showed, there was real disagreement. Independent nuclear analysts tried to fill the gap the best they could. The Institute for Science and International Security, a non-proliferation research group that has tracked Iran's nuclear program for years, continued publishing satellite-based assessments of Fordow and the surrounding area for months afterward, watching for signs of Iranian reconstruction activity, new access roads, or attempts to reopen sealed tunnel entrances. In late October of 2025, Grossi told reporters he had observed movement around the sites believed to be holding Iran's enriched uranium stockpiles, activity that raised new questions about whether Tehran was quietly relocating material closer to home or simply reorganizing what remained on site. By mid-November, the agency's official position was more cautious. Its assessment remained that the stockpiles had not been moved away from their original locations at Esfahan, Fordow, and Natanz, though the agency was careful to note that didn't rule out movement within those sites. The honest, unglamorous truth, nearly 5 months after the strikes, was that nobody outside Iran actually knew for certain where roughly 400 kilograms of near-weapons-grade uranium physically was. That unresolved question didn't stay academic for long. In the meantime, the American political reaction to the strikes themselves broke down largely along familiar lines, though not entirely predictable ones. Congressional briefings on the operation and its aftermath became contentious, with some lawmakers pressing intelligence officials directly on the gap between the president's public claims and the DIA's leaked internal assessment, while others argued that any preliminary battle damage assessment produced within 72 hours of a strike this complex was, by nature, going to be incomplete and subject to revision as more data came in. Satellite passes, signals intelligence, and eventually, if it ever happened, physical inspection. That argument wasn't unreasonable on its face. Early battle damage assessments are notoriously unreliable in the first days after any strike, let alone one against a target buried under a mountain that nobody could physically walk into and inspect. The trouble was that 7 months later, when the IAEA still couldn't say with confidence where Iran's enriched uranium stockpile actually was, that early uncertainty had never fully resolved into a clear answer either way. Diplomacy, for a while, appeared to be the path forward. Indirect nuclear talks, mediated by Oman, continued through the fall and into early 2026, alongside a significant U.S. military buildup across the Middle East, with reports suggesting real, if fragile, progress on both tracks at once. But according to the American Jewish Committee's own account of the period, President Trump said in early 2026 that he was, in his words, not thrilled with how those talks were going. Washington and Jerusalem, according to multiple outlets tracking the standoff, ultimately concluded that diplomacy had been exhausted and that a nuclear-armed Iran posed a threat neither government was willing to accept, unresolved uranium stockpile and all. On February 28, 2026, the war restarted, and this time it was not limited to a single night's strike package. According to the Council on Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker and Britannica's ongoing documentation of the period, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated campaign against Iran that opened with nearly 900 strikes across roughly 12 hours, hitting missile forces, air defenses, military infrastructure, and Iran's political and military leadership. That opening wave killed Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with dozens of other senior officials, a level of escalation that dwarfed anything seen in the 12-day war 8 months earlier. The same opening barrage also struck a girls' school adjacent to a naval base near Bandar Abbas, killing roughly 170 people according to Britannica's account of the campaign. A reminder that a war fought partly to answer a nuclear damage assessment dispute still, in the end, cost civilian lives on the ground. Iran retaliated broadly and immediately, launching missile and drone strikes against American and Allied targets across the region, hitting shipping and infrastructure near the Strait of Hormuz, and striking at the United Arab Emirates directly, where Iranian ballistic and drone attacks reportedly killed 3 foreign nationals, workers from Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, and injured dozens more according to sourced accounts of the strikes on the UAE, citing regional and wire reporting. Global shipping and energy markets, already jittery from months of tension around the Strait of Hormuz, absorbed the shock of a second Iran war inside a single year, with the earlier threat of a Hormuz closure during the 2025 fighting having already rattled oil markets once before the second war, made the risk concrete. Inside Iran itself, the pressure wasn't only coming from outside the country's borders. According to the American Jewish Committee's account of the period, the months surrounding the renewed war saw Iran's economy sliding further into crisis, its currency losing value sharply, and public frustration boiling over into protests that reportedly spread across all 31 of the country's provinces. Human rights organizations cited in that reporting said security forces killed more than 6,000 demonstrators and arrested tens of thousands more in the ensuing crackdown. A staggering, if difficult to independently verify, figure that underscores just how much internal instability was building inside Iran, even as its government confronted a second direct war with the United States and Israel. Israel itself came under sustained missile fire for the first time at this scale since the earlier war, with strikes reported across the country and a particularly deadly attack on a residential neighborhood in Beit Shemesh, killing multiple Israeli civilians, and Fordow was hit again. Alongside Natanz, and notably including strikes on Bushehr, Iran's only operational nuclear power plant, A IVAR 1000 reactor previously considered largely off-limits, given the radiological risk of striking an active power station. The February 2026 campaign returned to the same underground targets American B-2s had struck 8 months earlier. Vice President J.D. Vance, according to reporting compiled by the American Nuclear Society's Nuclear Newswire, characterized the new round of strikes as, in his words, very narrowly tailored to the specific goal of finishing what had been started at Fordow and dismantling what remained of Iran's nuclear weapons capability. Striking Bushehr at all was itself a significant departure from the caution both Israel and the United States had shown during the First War. An active, fueled nuclear power reactor carries a very different risk profile than an enrichment facility. A serious hit to its reactor core, rather than to surrounding infrastructure, could in theory release radioactive material well beyond the site itself, a scenario nuclear safety officials treat with far more caution than damage to a facility that merely spins centrifuges. The fact that Bushehr was targeted in February 2026 signaled just how far the boundaries of the conflict had shifted from the more contained single-night operation of June 2025. Grossi, for his part, maintained the same posture he'd held 8 months before, refusing to declare victory or defeat on Tehran's behalf, while noting that Iran's continued refusal to grant IAEA inspectors full access, combined with its still unresolved stockpile of near-weapons-grade uranium, meant the agency could not certify Iran's program was exclusively peaceful, even after 2 rounds of American and Israeli bombing. The fighting in this second, far larger war lasted 40 days. A ceasefire, brokered with Pakistan's mediation according to the Global Conflict Tracker, took effect on April 8, 2026, raising, as the American Jewish Committee's summary of the period put it, real hopes that the conflict had finally moved into a genuinely diplomatic phase after 14 months of intermittent and at times catastrophic warfare. 2 months later, in June, the United States and Iran reportedly agreed to a memorandum of understanding outlining a 60-day framework for renewed negotiations over the nuclear program and broader regional security, though even that framework was almost immediately tested by further Iranian attacks, including strikes on commercial shipping, according to the American Jewish Committee's ongoing tracking of the aftermath. The question of who was actually governing Iran after the strikes added another layer of confusion to an already murky picture. Trump, at various points after Khamenei's death, referred to regime change having occurred inside Iran, while also saying publicly that he distrusted the country's new leadership. A comment that itself underlined how unsettled the internal situation in Tehran remained, even months after the fighting had formally stopped. Which brings the story to where it stands as of this summer. According to the Institute for Science and International Security's most recent public analysis, published in June of 2026, the IAEA formally stopped conducting on-the-ground verification activities inside Iran after February 28th, the day the Second War began, and has been forced to rely primarily on commercial satellite imagery and second-hand reporting ever since, an approach the Institute itself describes as plainly inadequate for tracking something as sensitive as a live stockpile of enriched uranium. Iran, according to that same analysis, has allowed IAEA inspectors to visit exactly one site since the ceasefire, the Bushehr power plant, while withholding access to every facility actually affected by the strikes, including Fordow. Perhaps the most striking detail in the Institute's most recent reporting is this. Commercial satellite imagery reviewed in March of 2026 appeared to show a truck moving blue barrels, the kind used to store enriched uranium in overpacked containers, into a support facility near Fordow. Grossi has said publicly that Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium is believed to be held somewhere across Esfahan, Natanz, and Fordow, but believed is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Nobody with the authority to actually verify it has been allowed back inside since the fighting resumed. Analysts at the Institute also flagged newly visible construction around Natanz consistent with what they described as reinforced barrier structures at tunnel entrances, positioned, in their assessment, specifically to block a missile flying in on a straight approach toward the opening. Whether similar reinforcement has been attempted at Fordow itself is something satellite imagery alone, by the nature of an underground facility, simply cannot answer. It is exactly the same limitation that made the mountain so hard to assess back in June of 2025, still unresolved a full year later. So, what did they actually find under that mountain in the end? The honest answer, pieced together from the Pentagon's own briefings, the IAEA's cautious statements, a leaked intelligence assessment the administration called flat out wrong, and 18 months of satellite imagery from independent researchers, is this. The first strike on Fordow in June of 2025 did real, serious damage. It sealed entrances. It destroyed above-ground infrastructure at all 3 sites. It likely disabled at least some of the underground enrichment capability through direct impact, structural collapse, or simple loss of power, what it did not do by the Duer. S government's own internal leaked assessment was destroy Iran's enriched uranium stockpile or guarantee the program could not be rebuilt within months rather than years. That gap between obliterated and set back a few months is not a small technical disagreement. It's the difference between a war that ends and a war that pauses. And by February of 2026, the world got its answer about which one it actually was. To be clear about what remains contested and what doesn't, the fact that 14 GBU-57 bombs were dropped on Fordow and Natanz in June 2025 is confirmed directly by the Pentagon. The existence and rough contents of the leaked DIA assessment are confirmed by multiple independent outlets, including CNN and the New York Times, though the full text of that assessment has never been made public, and the Trump administration has consistently and strongly disputed its conclusions. The precise fate of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, whether it was moved before the 2025 strikes, where it has been kept since, and what condition it's in today, remains unconfirmed by any independent inspection, because the IAEA has not had verified physical access to the relevant sites since February 2026. Casualty figures from both the 2025 and 2026 conflicts vary by source and by the fog that surrounds any war fought partly inside a country with restricted press access, and should be read with that caveat in mind. What isn't contested is the shape of the story. A weapon 15 years in development met a target it was purpose-built for. The government that dropped it declared total success within hours. Its own intelligence agency, working from the same battlefield, quietly disagreed within days. And less than a year later, the two countries most invested in believing the matter was settled went to war over it again. A war that killed a head of state, drew in the UAE and Israel's civilian population, and still, as of this summer, has not produced a confirmed answer to the one question that started the entire disagreement. Where is the uranium, and is it still capable of becoming a weapon? So here's the honest question to leave you with, and there isn't a clean answer in any of the reporting above. When a democratic government's own military intelligence contradicts its own president's public claim about a strike within days, and the dispute is never fully resolved before a much larger war breaks out on the same question, who do you actually trust to tell you what happened under that mountain? The Pentagon that briefed the mission in granular, technical detail? The intelligence agency that leaked a far more cautious verdict and got called wrong for it? The IAEA, which never had enough access to be fully certain either way? Or the fact that 8 months later, everyone involved decided the question wasn't actually closed and went back to war to try to close it again? And it's worth sitting with just how strange that is. This wasn't a covert operation buried in classified archives for decades. It was one of the most heavily briefed, most publicly discussed military operations in recent American history. Pentagon press conferences, named generals speaking on the record, satellite imagery published within days by multiple outlets, a leaked internal government assessment fought over in real time on cable news. And even with all of that transparency, even with reporters and analysts and IAEA inspectors all working the same story from different angles, the most basic question anyone could ask, did it work, still doesn't have a universally agreed upon answer, more than a year and a second war later. Let me know what you think actually happened under that mountain, and whether you think the world will ever get a real, independently verified answer. Thanks for watching.